Parent Grain Reconstruction in MTEX, the new variant graph approach. So today I will mostly be looking at the existing or the pre-existing, let's say, algorithms in MTEX and how the variant graph approach, this new algorithm, has been derived from those. Just to give you a short timeline of parent grain reconstruction in MTEX. So where are we at right now? So the first parent grain reconstruction was implemented in MTEX 5.4. That was in July 2020. And this initial version was still a little bit clunky, and it really got a major overhaul with the introduction of the parent grain reconstructor class, which happened a little bit more than a year ago with MTEX 5.6. In between, there were some minor improvements to the parent grain reconstructor class with MTEX 5.7. And now we recently released MTEX 5.8, and this version also features this new variant graph algorithm, which I'm going to be talking a little bit more about today. As Ralf already mentioned, this has been a very fruitful collaboration between mainly 4 participants, and even though I'm presenting here, I'm presenting on behalf of all 4 of these nice people who has been very nice to work with over the last 2 years. So our agenda will be that I very briefly touch upon parent grain reconstruction. I know Ralf has already done it, but I will just do it from a little bit different angle, and I keep it short, of course. Show you the basics, then give an overview of which different approaches exist. Then I will go a little bit into the algorithms that we have in MTEX, so explain the local neighbor-level voting approaches, the grain graph approach, and then hopefully we get a natural transition of why this variant graph approach is important and how it derives from those previous 2 approaches. And here I want to kind of show you a little bit how the algorithm works, how the performance of this algorithm is, and give you some examples in the end. So, parent grain reconstruction basics. We have phase transformations, of course, in materials, and most of those phase transformations happen actually by either cooling, heating, change in pressure, change in load. Excuse me, could somebody maybe mute one of the participants? Oh, I can do that actually. Oh, there we go. One very famous phase transformation is the gamma to alpha prime martensitic transformation, which we see happening here in this video during cooling. You can see it's quite an abrupt displacive transformation that happens. Another quite famous one is beta to alpha transformation in titanium alloys. This is a diffusional transformation that happens, and from this high temperature beta microstructure, we end up having in alpha microstructure, and we can see that all those parent grains here, so these are the beta grains, are being basically fragmented into a lot of small child grains. And the whole purpose of parent grain reconstruction is, given a map of those child grains, can we reconstruct the parent microstructure? That's in the end of the day all we want to do. So the phase transformation occurs often, not always, via a favorable orientation relationship. And when this is the case, we actually can do parent grain reconstruction. Otherwise, we would really be lost. This is the only key we have. In steel, the parent-child orientation relationship between austenite gamma and martensite alpha prime looks somewhat like this. That we have the 111 plane of austenite parallel to the 110 plane. And as Ralf earlier showed, this is how it would look in MTEX, that we have the parent orientation times the inverse orientation relationship to get the child orientation. And here this is, for example, a roughly 45-degree rotation around the z-axis. In titanium, it looks similar. So we also have a parent and child phase and rotation, axis, angle, and so forth. This works for all the phase transformations with orientation relationships. And of course, we are in crystals that have a certain symmetry inside of them. So in red, we can show this FCC crystal here, and in blue, we can show this martensitic variant that formed here on the left side. But due to the crystal symmetry that we can put in as a group of symmetry matrices, we get, in this case, 24 variants in the BCC martensitic phase. This, of course, complicates the problem a little bit. So let's have a look at some general approaches that are being chosen for parent grain reconstruction. If you want to do parent grain reconstruction, you would often start with an EBSD data set. So this is what you get out of your microscope. And in this case, we have a martensitic, bluff martensitic microstructure here. In MTEC, often the first step is to compute grains from the EBSD data. So we get to this data, and it looks, of course, a lot nicer, but if it's better or not, that's the question. If we now show the EBSD data again and just put the grain boundaries that we computed around this EBSD data, and we maybe look at a snippet, we can see what actually happened. So a lot of, let's say, similarly oriented EBSD pixels were grouped into grain objects. So what does this mean for us when we work with grains in parent grain reconstruction? So we basically binned down our 320,000 EBSD points of this map into 7,000 grains. So that's a factor of 46 that we applied. And that, of course, means if we want to do reconstruction that involves a lot of calculation, this is going to be a lot more efficient and a lot faster. So that's nice. But of course, on the downside, we also lose something, and that's especially intergranular misorientation and the local orientation relationship, which Timon also asked about earlier. Like, this is, of course, information that we kind of throw out as soon as we compute the grains. To look at this example here, we can see, for example, that this large grain here seems to have two different orientations, one that's more like, I don't know, light pink, and one that's more orange. These are quite closely related, but they're so related, in fact, that this general grain computation with a 3-degree threshold didn't capture them as two different grains. And this is the case because in martensite, we have a lot of variants that are very closely related to each other, and they're basically grouped into their blocks, as it's called in Lath martensite. So a little bit of information we lose, but we win a lot of performance. So traditionally, there are some algorithms that are pixel-based, so which look at all the orientations of the EBSD data, and some that are grain-based, that look more at the grouped data. Pixel-based, if I order the main references from newest to latest, we have those 3 references here, and they operate on cropped sections of the orientation data set, with the first algorithm in 2010 being introduced by Miyamoto at Alibi. And then we have the grain-based algorithms, and those operate on weighted graphs constructed from the grain map. And here we have a lot more references, and it also seems that, let's say, the most recent algorithms seem to prefer this general direction of reconstruction. And again, those references are sorted from latest to earliest. And yeah, we actually have 2 papers here. They are on the MTEX algorithms. Then we have this paper by Ben Britton. I'll highlight this because he's going to give a talk later today, which I'm very pleased about. Then Tuomo is going to talk just after me. And I'm especially pleased that today we have Lionel Germain and Cyril Caron in the audience, who will also be presenting talks. And those have really been on the forefront many years ago already in developing new parent grain reconstruction algorithms. So I think we have a very nice, let's say, group and lineup today for discussing the different developments. So let's maybe start with the easiest of the, let's say, MTEX algorithms for parent grain reconstruction, which would be the local neighbor-level voting approaches. And one simple one would be the triple point approach, which could be named the nucleation type approach. So what we do here is that we first find triple point junctions and find common parent orientations at these junctions. So in this data set here, which was completely alpha titanium, we could just crop into a section and actually see that there are tons of triple points. I just highlight a few of them, but you can definitely see more of them. So this would be a perfect data set to apply this method to, because this method works well for a few clearly separated variants. So as soon as we have a lot of them and they're closely related, this is more difficult. And we need a high density of triple junctions within the parent grains, which definitely is the case in this data set. So in MTEX, we do this by this command calc triple point votes, TP votes. And we have 2 fits that we can introduce to this command. So the first fit is the fit of the common parent orientation. Oh, sorry. The fit of the common parent orientation needs to be better than 2.5 degrees in order to do the reconstruction. And then we can also look at the second best fit. So if the second best fit is worse than 5 degrees, then we also want to reconstruct. If the second fit is quite close to actually those 2.5 degrees of the first best fit, we're not very sure, and then we don't want to reconstruct. So we can basically give the confidence here. And then as soon as we have done this, when we've calculated the votes, we can then also reconstruct the parent from these votes. So it's a quite simple procedure. Then after we've done this triple point reconstruction, we get this map on the right, and we can see that we almost already finished with the parent grain reconstruction in this data set. But of course, we can then fill up the gaps. So everything that's white is still unreconstructed child data. And for this, we can use the grain boundary approach. That's also a local neighbor level voting approach. And this one is often termed the growth approach. That's because in this particular example, we're going to grow the reconstructed parent grains into the regions of the remaining child grains. This is a preferred method when sufficient parent phase nuclei are already present in beforehand, which is definitely the case here. And in MTEX, we would do this in this way. Here we've arranged this growth algorithm into a loop of 3 iterations. And we have done this that we basically can start with a very low threshold and then step by step increase this threshold. So here by this threshold, we mean again, the fit of the common parent orientation has to be better than 2.5, 5.0, and 7.5 degrees in each, in the consecutive iterations. And by this extra option P2C, we indicate that we only want to look at the parent-child grain boundary so that the parent phase can, let's say, organically grow into the child grains. So on the right side, we can now look how this happens. So right now we are at k equals 0, so the loop has not begun yet. And then if we start going to the first iteration, we're almost fully reconstructed already. And then with the second and the third, we just get a little bit better. And in this way, we can do a very simple reconstruction for this type of data set. So how does this voting-based process actually work inside of MTEX if we look a little bit closer at it? And for this, we have to depict the grains as a weighted graph. And I'm going to show you now how this is going to look. So when we have the grains in our grain map right here, these are child grains. Now we are actually at a different example. So this is the mountain-citic microstructure again in steels. And we look at, maybe this cropped region here. We can then go to each grain and see, okay, which neighbors does it have? Here we have an inclusion that only has 1 neighbor. This one has 2 neighbors. Here we have many neighbors. And we can then build a graph from basically the neighboring grains. Each of these grains has also 24 possible parent variants. I'm not going to repeat all of this, but by these 2 relations, we can get, let's say, the variants, and by the symmetries of the parent and the child, it's determined how many variants we get. And in this case, we can actually, for each child grain that we have in the microstructure, there are 24 possible solutions for the parent phase that we want to reconstruct. Of course, this is very difficult to depict in a grain graph, and that's why we chose to introduce these algorithms on a so-called simplified grain graph, where we look at some different child grains, which are those circles here, and some parent grains. This is the square one. And here we only allow 3 possible parent variants per grain. And that's just hypothetical to make this example a little bit easier. And what we can see is that there are some grains. For example, grain 5 is very connected to grain 2, 8, 9, and 6. And each of these grains has 3 potential parent orientations based on the orientation relationship. So in this local neighbor level voting approach, what we do is we compare the misorientations between the possible parent orientations in one grain with the possible parent orientations in the neighboring grain. And we then translate this misorientation angle into a probability that those 2 grains are related by the same parent grain. So if we have a low misorientation angle, we have a high probability, because with low misorientation, there's a high match. And in the example of, for example, this grain 2, we can then go and look at, okay, there's 0.8 probability. So it's the top value is 1. We have 0.8 probability for those 2 being related by this parent variant, then 0.6 here, 0.5 for the green one. So our first option is definitely that this grain should be yellow orientation. So we sum these probabilities at each node, and this way we get a reconstruction. And that's basically all the magic. Of course, for more difficult data sets, this simple approach does not really work that well. And that's why in the past we implemented this grain graph approach as well, which I'm going to highlight a little bit now how this works. We again start by building this grain graph just as I showed before, and we also apply weights to the edges. And these are exactly the same weights that we computed before for the local neighbor approach. So again, have the 0.8, 0.6. So this is basically initializing the grain graph. So again, low misorientation angle is high probability. And then we store this in a sparse adjacency matrix. And we do this by calculating this, by running this command here, calc graph. And here those values, threshold and tolerance, they basically indicate on how we want to translate this orientation angle to a probability. So depending on how our data set looks, we want to maybe use different values for this distribution here. So when we do this, we actually get this sparse adjacency matrix, and this looks a little bit like this. So we have in this data set around 7,000 child grains, and we can see those on both the y and the x-axis, and this is a metric. This is a symmetric matrix, and all the colored points here are basically spots in the matrix that are occupied by a probability value. So in a way, this shows the connectivity between different grains and their probability values as scheduled or as shown down here. Of course, right now this is just a local neighborhood approach, and for this to become a real grain graph, we need to cluster and extend this graph now. So for this, we use something called Markovian clustering, and this consists out of 4 steps, which are expansion, inflation, normalization, and pruning. I'm going to explain now how this really works and like how it's easy to understand. So we iterate these 4 steps until we don't see any change anymore in this matrix, which is the convergence criterion. And let's maybe have a look at one example. So for example, we want to know the probability between grain 1 and 5, right? But grain 1 and 5 are not connected initially because they're not direct neighbors. But as soon as we do this expansion step, what actually happens is that since grain 1 and grain 2 have a probability, and grain 2 and grain 5 have a probability, this probability is now extended to also have a probability for grain 1 and grain 5. So the graph actually after one iteration looks somewhat like this. And now we basically also have the second neighbors connected to each other with a probability. And this way we can basically then build a larger and larger graph and see, okay, which grains are likely to belong to the same parent grain, and this way cluster our microstructure according to this criterion. Yeah, the way we do this clustering is by running this command cluster graph, and the inflation power here is a parameter, as we said 1.6 here. The inflation power is set right here. So now I have to, of course, explain what inflation power actually means. So in this first expansion step, we basically expand the parent graph to also connect, let's say, higher level neighbors. And by this inflation parameter, then we take the probabilities that we have stored in the matrix, and we use this exponent alpha, which is usually taken bigger than 1. And with an exponent bigger than 1, what this means that probabilities that are lower than 1 are slowly being further diminished, and probabilities that are higher than 1 after this expansion step are actually strengthened further. So basically we look at strong links and further strengthen them in order to at some point naturally distill some clusters in our microstructure. So after this inflation step, we normalize probabilities again, because here we of course have some that are higher than 1, but we want to kind of keep them normalized. And then at the end, we do a pruning step. And the pruning basically just means that all probabilities that are sufficiently low, so smaller than a certain parameter delta, are just being kicked out by setting them to 0. And this ensures that our matrix stays sufficiently sparse here, and also helps to converge the algorithm eventually. And convergence means that then each of these child grains has decided on one unique parent orientation, or one unique cluster. Let's say this cluster won't change anymore. So after after we've run this cluster graph command, our matrix, we can still plot it again, and it looks a little bit different. So now it's not symmetric anymore, and you can see that we actually now have something different on the y-axis compared to the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we now actually have grain clusters. So we can see that there are fewer grains here on this y-axis. There are a lot of gaps, but that each time there is some data, we have quite long lines. That basically means that we have some clusters now that cluster all the grains that are within one line, given on the x-axis here. So now we can have a look at this grain graph and maybe intuitively think about, okay, which clusters could we actually form with this graph, right? So we see that, for example, that there are some grains that have a green parent orientation. So this is a possible cluster. But we also see that there's actually a yellow cluster here on the left side. And there could also be like a turquoise cluster on the right side. And the issue is that there are some grains, grain 2, grain 8, and grain 5, that really have multiple solutions that could be feasible for clustering. And that's, of course, where parent grain reconstruction becomes complicated. Some of you might have noticed that there's a little bit of an issue. So just to tell you that the the blackness or the darkness, let's say, of those connectors means high probability, and if they're almost white, it's low probability. So these are proportional to the probability value. And we see that we actually have a very high probability that grain 4 and grain 5 are connected or are belonging to the same parent grain, even though we can see by the individual suggested orientations that there cannot really be any match for those two grains. So how does this happen? This happened during expansion. And what happened is that during expansion, there was no, let's say, direct probability for G4, G5, but we then basically took the probability for G2, G4, G2, G5, and summed or added that to the probability for G4, G8, G4, G5, so that's the extension of the probabilities, and then calculate a new probability for G4 and G5. And the logic here is that if G4 and G2 are related by a parent orientation and G2 and G5 are related by a parent orientation, then probably also G4 and G5 are related by a parent orientation. But we can actually see that this does not hold. And that's actually one of the, let's say, intrinsic problems of the grain graph approach, that this is really happening and it's giving problems. So we can see that we get a high weight G4, G5 despite we have no common parent orientation. And as a result of this, all the nodes become one cluster. So because this turquoise cluster is quite strong, the yellow cluster is quite strong, and we now have this connector, all of those grains suddenly fall into the same cluster. And this is, of course, a problem for us, since we know that the right side cannot be the same parent grain as the left side. So how does this look on a microstructure specifically? Let's just look at one grain. So this is one prior austenite grain in our mountain-sitting microstructure, and inside we see all the child grains from which we want to calculate the parent orientation. You might already be able to see from the different colors that are basically separated by those quite even lines that there are actually some annealing twins inside of this grain, so it's a quite challenging grain to reconstruct. So when we run this grain graph with an inflation parameter of 1.2, this is quite a low inflation parameter, which means that we actually build quite large clusters because we are very slow in actually disconnecting different edges between the grains. And if we grow those large clusters, we actually end up with a very poor reconstruction. The clusters are actually shown by those dark black outlines here. And for example, this cluster here, we can see that it actually went far beyond the boundary of what should be the austenite grain. And that as a result, we actually were not able to afterwards calculate a parent orientation here because we didn't find any good match. The same has happened over here. We couldn't find any parent orientation. We can generally see that this clustering is basically extending over the boundaries of the prior austenite grain. And this is, of course, a big problem. We call this under-clustering. I'm not sure if this is a proper English word, but it's quite intuitive, I would say. Of course, to counterfight this, we can use a higher inflation parameter, and this way we enforce smaller clusters. And for this parameter 1.6, we end up with 59 clusters. And this way we can almost reconstruct the entire grain with a 97% reconstructed. But there's still, let's say, some areas that have not been reconstructed. There are still some clusters that actually extend over the parent grain boundary. And also there are a lot of, let's say, small clusters in areas where it technically would not be necessary to have that many clusters. I mean, you could easily, let's say, sum up those 4 clusters and it would still describe the same parent orientation. But this, we call this, of course, overclustering, is, of course, a result of the inflation parameter, and we get a lot better of a reconstruction by doing this. Still, having so many clusters means there's a lot of computation involved afterwards in identifying the parent orientation, because up to here we only have clustered grains that are likely belong to the same parent grain. We still have to determine the parent orientation. And also we might form some very small clusters, for example here, where we just don't have enough variants included to then do the actual parent orientation confidently. So there are definitely some problems with this grain graph approach. And to now maybe summarize the pros and cons of the local level voting approach and the grain graph approach, I would name the local neighbor level voting approach the short-sighted accountant, because it's very good at storing all the solutions around it. It directly yields the parent orientation, so that's great. We don't have to compute it afterwards. But the problem is that it only regards the direct neighbor grains. So it doesn't really look further than just the first neighbor. And this way, it's a little bit of a short-sighted algorithm. The grain graph approach could be called the eager networker. So it's pretty good at considering higher order neighbors. It's very fast and versatile. So it's really good to get something done very fast as well. But the problem is that it still forms some inconsistent and non-optimal clusters, as I just showed. And it does not directly yield the parent orientation. So after we form those clusters, we still have to do some optimization problem to find the parent orientation. So it's very eager, but maybe not the most accurate of them all. And of course, our question, our question was, can we design an algorithm that combines the strength of both approaches? And in this way, we came up with this variant graph approach, which is now basically the main topic of this talk, how we actually got the variant graph approach from those previous approaches and how does it relate to that. So if we again recap on the grain graph approach, we can see that we constructed a grain graph of all the neighboring grains down here. And then we assigned probability weights to all the edges. How does the variant graph now work? So here we actually construct a variant graph of all possible neighboring variants, So for example, if we look at grain 1 in the grain graph, we had 3 different possible parent orientations. And now this grain is basically split up into its possible parent variants. We have grain 1 variant 1, grain 1 variant 2, grain 1 variant 3. In this way, we have a lot more nodes to work with. What we then do, we don't any longer put probability weights everywhere, but we define edges at high probability values. So let's say non-zero probability values, or probability values that are larger than a slight threshold. And this way, we can then, let's say, connect directly the parent variants of different neighboring grains without just, let's say, generally connecting the grains with each other. So in a way, one could say that the variant graph is a generalization of the grain graph, or that the grain graph is a specialization of the variant graph. And this is because the grain graph really just asks, is there any variant that fits between neighboring grains? And if yes, we are probably part of the same parent grain. Whereas the variant graph really asks which variant that you can offer actually fits to which variant of my variants that I offer when we compare 2 grains. So here we really care about which variant. And in this way, it's a generalization. So the variant graph approach uses a lot more nodes, as I already showed you. So here with 3 variants, it's 3 times as many nodes. And that, of course, could make you a little bit worried about computational efficiency. But the good news is that we don't necessarily need more edges. So we'll show later there are more edges than in the grain graph, but not really 3 times as many edges, because we only connect parent variants that really have a high likelihood of actually not being completely unrelated with each other. And this amount of non-zero edges is actually what is proportional to the memory usage. So it is actually feasible to run this algorithm. The clustering of this algorithm, so we again clustered similar to the grain graph in an adapted Markovian algorithm. And after clustering, both of these look like this. This is after the first iteration. So we could, of course, run further in iterations as well. And the good thing is that we get immediately the parent orientation and also the next best fit in this variant graph approach, which I'm going to demonstrate now on an example. So we earlier had this troublesome grain 5 here, and grain 5 really want to be connected to grain 4, even though they didn't have any common parent orientation, which was a huge problem, right? So how does this now look in the variant graph? In the variant graph, you can see that we have grain 5 up here, and it has figured out that it has a pretty good correlation with this grain 3, grain 6, and grain 9, those neighbors in this turquoise cluster, because they have a very closely related variant with each other. So these are highly coupled. We can also see that grain 4 now is very nicely associated with the yellow cluster. But grain 5 actually also has some connectivity to the green cluster, which we saw before. And before this was a problem because this green cluster connected all of these clusters with each other. And now actually this green cluster only shows, okay, this would be a viable second solution, because we can see that those lines are a little bit brighter. In this way, we can now say, okay, grain 5 is very likely belonging to this turquoise cluster, and there's a okay second solution for the green cluster. And this was not possible before in the grain graph. And most importantly, we've now broken the bond between grain 4 and grain 5 by this. So there's no more connection between those 2 clusters, and they can basically stay separated. So let's look at the variant graph in operation. Maybe let's focus on one child grain. So this is again this prior Austin grain we looked at before, where we have a lot of twin-related variants. And we now look at just one child grain and see how this connects to its neighbors within the variant graph approach. This is a very nice graphic that Tuomo made, where we can see all the nodes being connected. So we have initially at 0 iterations, that's basically where we have this local neighbor approach, where we just initialize the graph. We have 22 nodes to neighboring grains. And sorry, we are connected to 22 neighboring grains by 162 edges. And we can see that after, sorry, let me just go back. After this first reconstruction, we get this reconstruction result down here. And we already get, let's say, a pretty good idea of what the parent orientations should be. But we can also see that we have a lot of local flipping of the orientation, and all those pink boundaries actually indicate twin boundaries. So we basically have two twin-related orientations that are flipping back and forth locally. And only when we start actually expanding the variant graph, so this is for 3 iterations, we now look at second order neighbors, third, fourth order neighbors, and so forth. We actually get some more confidence in more unique and larger areas that have the same parent orientation. And if we continue this for 10 iterations, we expand even further and we get even more confident. And now we actually, let's say, see that the outline of this annealing twin interface here becomes quite evident. There's still some, let's say, grains in the boundary region that like to flip back and forward. And this is really an age-old problem. And I think Tuomo is going to address this later on in his talk, what the problems are and what maybe possible solutions in the futures could yield. I want to now briefly show you the effect of the inflation parameter alpha. So if you remember, inflation is what we use in the second step after we expand the graph. We use this inflation parameter, and if we have a high inflation parameter, we usually cut down the graph very quickly and force it to converge, whereas if we have a low one, we actually allow it to expand very broadly. If we look at how this inflation parameter relates with the number of non-zero edges, we can see that the number of non-zero edges increases when we decrease alpha. So these are the number of iterations, how often we iterate this graph, and this is how many edges we look at. If we keep this exactly at 1, this inflation parameter, this basically means if inflation is not happening, this is just crossed out, we then yield something called multiple solutions. So it means that for each child grain, we actually keep a lot of different parent grains solutions that are viable with different weights in the end. And we don't really want to decide between those. So that can be quite useful. But of course, if you have a pretty large map, this also means you have a lot of non-zero edges, which will cost you a lot in memory usage. What we can then do is we can cut down on the number of solutions quite quickly by introducing this inflation parameter. So already at just 1.02, we start basically at some point decreasing our number of non-zero edges towards what seems to be in the end constant parameter. And this constant parameter, or the constant number, would mean convergence, which means that each child grain then has decided on one parent orientation in the end of the day. If we are very aggressive with this inflation parameter, we can really keep the number of non-zero edges very low. And this means that we have a quite locally restricted search. So we don't really want to expand the parent, the clustering very far out. We really just want to search in our local neighborhood. So in this way, we can actually quite continuously, let's say, transition between a very, very global kind of approach to a very local approach that's very close to the local neighbor approach. And yeah, as I told you before already, I'll just recap. The number of non-zero edges in this matrix here is equivalent to the memory usage. So you have to keep these things here in mind when you're using the algorithm. So let's talk about memory then, because we have, of course, more edges than we used to have before in the grain graph approach, and this goes in hand with more memory usage. So this graph here I've recorded for a 4 million pixel EBSD dataset. I'm going to show you the dataset later, where we did a reconstruction. So this was love martensitic microstructure. And we can see that at the peak of execution, we almost use 64 gigabytes of memory. The execution time is around 500 seconds, which I think is still quite efficient for such an approach. Yeah, so I would say the memory usage is significant but manageable. It depends on the reconstruction parameters. That's what I showed before. I think this one was used for 1.05 inflation parameters, so that was also keeping it, like allowing the graph to expand quite a lot. Good news is that we can use virtual memory for this, so that very large maps can still, that we can still work with large maps. And if you have a very large map, you can maybe section it into smaller maps to do the reconstruction. There's one last thing that we introduced is that we, in steel, where we have those 24 variants, we can actually reduce this problem quite confidently to 12 variants and still get a very good reconstruction. So this can either be done by a small option that we can include similar, or we can also just use the Nishiyama-Wasserman orientation relationship that by nature only has 12 variants. But what we can see in this pole figure up here is that we have those closely related variants, and if we just we can basically just combine them and combine the probabilities for those two variants to make the computation a lot more efficient. So if we go back to this grain from before and we look into this region, we can see that we have a couple of different austenitic prior austenite orientations here, and that they are twin related with each other, which means that they share a common 1-1-1 plane. And what this means is that they're also going to share a lot of common or very similar variants with each other. So if we then look at the nodes, so if we look at child grain 1 and child grain B, over which parent orientation they could be connected, there are actually a lot of different parent variants with which they could be connected that almost yield the same solution. But all those solutions are being considered in the calculation, and they are taking space up in the memory. And what we can do is by actually combining the probabilities of closely related variants. So here we group variant 1524 and variant 69. We can basically cut down by a factor of 4 on those connections and still get a very, very good reconstruction. We actually didn't see any drawback in the reconstruction result. We're even thinking that it might be even better to get rid of this twinning ambiguity, but that's not completely settled yet. What's important is that the memory usage in this case goes down to less than half of those 64 gigabytes, and we even get a little bit faster, not much faster, but a little bit faster. So this is quite useful in the case of steel reconstruction, where this algorithm really, I think, will be a prominent application. Just to then maybe show a little bit of comparison how the grain graph approach and the variant graph approach perform side by side. I mean, we see these two reconstruction results earlier with low inflation parameter and high inflation parameter. I mean, the low one may be disregarded because it's really a poor result. But if you compare with the one with where we used a lot of clusters, we can now see the results by the variant graph approach. And only after 3 iterations, we already get a quite useful, I would say, reconstruction where we are staying within the boundaries of where the grain should be. And this is really the large strength of this variant graph approach. We seem to have pretty realistic annealing twin boundaries as well. Especially up here, it does seem to do a better job, and around here compared to the grain graph approach. And after 10 iterations, I think we get even better. So a lot of those local, let's say, twinned regions have disappeared that physically don't really look like a annealing twin. We still have some region, though, where the algorithm is a little bit undetermined. So there's still some work left to do. And most importantly, in the end, if we look at all the, let's say, martensitic orientations, these are the blue small dots in our pole figure here, and we see which martensitic variants are being contributed by the different austenite orientations, we can see that all the martensitic orientations experimentally have been accounted for by the reconstructed parent orientations that we've determined. So this is how it looks on the entire map. So the grain we looked at before was down here in this white area. So this is this 4 million pixel EBSD map. On the left side, we see martensite with, with the prior austenite grains already outlined with black boundaries, just to make it visually a little bit more pleasing. They're of course not there when you do the work. And then on the right side, we have the reconstructed orientations on EBSD orientation level, and the white boundaries show the CSR3 boundaries that are associated with the annealing twins. So I think generally this is quite a nice reconstruction. Of course, it's difficult to judge by just looking at it, but we are pretty happy with it, and we compare it to some other state-of-the-art algorithms, and yeah, we think it performed quite well. So I will now skip forward to the conclusions. The variant graph approach is a new algorithm for parent grain reconstruction that combines the strengths of the local neighbor voting and the grain graph approaches. It's excellent in retaining the prior parent boundaries. It's powerful to resolve the twin ambiguity, even though some work still remains, and Tuomo is going to touch on this in this next talk. There are other algorithms in MTEX that are still relevant. So the ones I talked about initially, it's not really that we have to discard them. They're still relevant and powerful for simpler reconstruction tasks, since the variant graph is, let's say, a quite big algorithm that I, for example, wouldn't use on a very simple reconstruction exercise. But I think for complicated stuff, the variant graph approach is the method of choice. And there are already some existing and future, let's say, development extensions to further improve this algorithm. So one extension that I just showed was this reduction to 12 variants. We also basically have an infrastructure to include morphological parameters into the reconstruction as well. So where we, for example, not only look at the orientation difference, but also, for example, the curvature of a boundary of the child grains to maybe say, okay, these look somewhat laugh-like, so probably they should be in the same grain. So there are a lot of, let's say, options for extending this algorithm that would make it even better in the future. I think also here Tuomo will talk a little bit about how morphology could play a role in the future. So we've published 2 papers on this stuff by now. So the first one, the more general one, is the parent grain reconstruction from partially or fully transformed microstructures in MTEC, where we present the overall framework in a way. And we just basically published this one in Materialia, where we introduced the variant graph approach to improve parent grain reconstruction. And similar to my talk today, it also is a pretty good review on actually how does the grain graph work, how does the local neighborhood work. And so it's just also a very good summary, I think, of the state of the art. As a last slide, I want to make a little bit of advertisement for this toolbox ORTools, since some of you might know it, some of you might have never heard of it. So after this presentation, you will. ORTools is a function library for orientation relationship discovery, advanced orientation relationship analysis, and the plotting of visually stunning and informative publication-ready figures. Visually stunning, that's at least our opinion. There's probably some personal preferences here, but the idea is that in MTech, of course, we give you all the tools to actually do the reconstruction, but for some people, it might be difficult to make then long codes and figure these things out themselves. So we've done a lot of examples and a lot of ready-made plotting functions to do very easy, let's say, parent grain reconstruction. So there are pre-written workflows with examples and tutorial videos. And another, let's say, reason for ORTools existence is that there are some applications that are too specific to really include into the more general MTech. And for example, workflows for analyzing Martin-Cittick microstructures. So when it really goes into very specific things, we thought it might be a better idea to collect these things into a different toolbox. You can find the toolbox on GitHub, called ORTools. And we just recently released the 2.0 version of this toolbox. So that now includes that we can do grain refinement at the variant level. So we can compute grains not only based on the orientation similarity, but now after we've done the reconstruction and we have the variant IDs for each EBSD pixel, we can use this to implement, to reconstruct the grains, and then in this way get some variant information grains. This we can then use to also analyze variant pairing or block boundary analysis. So an example of this is shown on the right side, and people who work with steel microstructures know that this is very much directly related to the properties of your material in the end. So this is quite handy. In the end, Tuomo Niessen also contributed a function that's called the block width measurement. And here we can then, by a mean field approach, measure, get an idea of what the block width in our material is, which again is quite important for the properties of the material. And at last, we also added a new example number 7, and that's basically looking at the parent grain reconstruction with this new variant graph approach. So there's also a around 45 minutes long video where I explain a little bit how it works in practice in MTech with ORTools. So maybe if you're interested, you can check that out. With that, I would say, I conclude my talk, and I hope we can have a bit of a nice discussion.